Jesus was gone, but Caiaphas remained high priest. For a while, his power survived.
Caiaphas did not disappear after the crucifixion of Jesus. Years later, his name was still connected to the center of power in Jerusalem, until a Roman authority removed him from the high priesthood, and his trail all but vanished from the ancient record. For centuries, that silence left one unsettling question unanswered. What happened to one of the most recognizable figures in the Passion narrative after he lost his power? Then, nearly 2,000 years later, a tomb was discovered in Jerusalem. Inside was a limestone burial box bearing an inscription linked to a disturbingly familiar name, Caiaphas. But did it really belong to the high priest described in the Gospels? Because somewhere between what Acts tells us, what the Jewish historian Josephus records, and what that ancient tomb can actually prove, lies a part of Caiaphas' story that is still often told incorrectly. When we think of Caiaphas, we almost always think of a single night. Jesus is arrested, brought before the authorities, and within hours handed over to the Roman power of Pontius Pilate. The crucifixion follows, the story moves toward the tomb, and Caiaphas seems to simply disappear from history. But he didn't. After the crucifixion of Jesus, Caiaphas remained the high priest in Jerusalem. And that makes what happened next far more interesting. Joseph Caiaphas held one of the most important positions in Judea. He had served as high priest since around AD 18, was connected by marriage to the influential family of Annas, and exercised religious authority in a region under Roman rule. The fact that he remained in office for nearly 2 decades is significant, especially at a time when Roman officials could appoint and remove high priests. It was within this delicate political environment that the conflict surrounding Jesus unfolded. The Gospels place Caiaphas and certain members of the priestly leadership among the central figures in the events leading up to Jesus' execution, but there is an essential distinction. Crucifixion was a Roman punishment, and Jesus was executed under the authority of Pontius Pilate. This is not a story of the Jewish people bearing collective responsibility, but of specific leaders operating within a Judea that was itself under Roman control. And the crucifixion did not bring Caiaphas' story to an end. The book of Acts mentions his name again when Peter and John are brought before the authorities in Jerusalem. The movement surrounding Jesus was still growing, while Caiaphas remained in a position of power. That raises the question at the heart of this story. What happened to him after that? Ancient sources allow us to follow Caiaphas until his removal from the high priesthood. Beyond that point, his fate becomes far less certain. Then, nearly 2,000 years later, an archaeological discovery in Jerusalem raised an extraordinary possibility: a 1st century tomb containing an ossuary associated with the name Caiaphas. But did it really belong to him? That is the trail we're going to follow, what the New Testament reports, what the Jewish historian Josephus records, and what archaeology can and cannot prove. Because the true fate of Caiaphas becomes most intriguing precisely where history stops giving us certainty. To understand what happened to Caiaphas after the crucifixion, we first need to understand why he was able to remain at the center of power for so long. Caiaphas was not simply one priest among many. Around AD 18, during the Roman administration of Valerius Gratus, he became the high priest of Jerusalem, one of the most important religious positions in Judea. But that office existed within a delicate political reality. Judea was under Roman rule, and imperial authorities directly influenced the appointment and removal of high priests. That placed Caiaphas in a difficult position. He had to represent an institution deeply connected to Jewish identity while exercising his authority under the watchful eye of Rome, and Caiaphas managed to maintain that balance for roughly 18 years. That longevity is striking. It does not mean we can claim that Caiaphas was secretly allied with Rome, or that we know what private agreements he may have made to remain in office. The sources simply do not allow us to go that far. But holding such a sensitive position for so many years suggests that his leadership was able to function within the political conditions imposed on Judea at the time. Caiaphas was also part of a powerful priestly network. He was the son-in-law of Annas, who had previously served as high priest and remained an influential figure even after leaving the office. Several members of that family would eventually hold the same position. This helps explain why Annas continues to appear prominently in the Gospels, even though Caiaphas was officially the high priest. At the center of this entire world stood the temple in Jerusalem. The temple was far more than a religious building. It was the spiritual heart of Judaism in that period, and during major festivals such as Passover, Jerusalem filled with pilgrims arriving from different regions. Sacrifices, offerings, and the temple tax were all part of that religious world, while the presence of enormous crowds also heightened Roman concern over possible unrest. And it was during precisely this time of year that Jesus arrived in Jerusalem. The Gospels describe his entrance into the city, his public teaching, and above all his actions in the temple, where he overturned the tables of money changers and drove out merchants. The exact meaning of that act continues to be debated, but within the Gospel narratives one thing is unmistakable. Tensions between Jesus and certain authorities escalated rapidly, and there was a political dimension that could not be separated from that moment. During Passover, Jerusalem commemorated Israel's liberation from foreign domination while living under Roman occupation. Any popular movement could attract attention, especially when enormous crowds were gathered in the city. It is within this setting that the Gospel of John places one of the best-known statements attributed to Caiaphas. Faced with concern that the situation surrounding Jesus could provoke a Roman response, Caiaphas argues that it would be better for one man to die for the people than for the entire nation to perish. John also gives those words a theological meaning. But within the narrative itself, they present Caiaphas confronting a very practical problem. How do you preserve stability when religion, crowds, messianic expectations, and Roman power all converge in the same place? That does not allow us to enter Caiaphas' mind or claim that we know every motive behind his actions. What we can say is that the Gospels place him among the authorities involved in the events that preceded Jesus being handed over to Pilate, and that distinction matters. Caiaphas was a priestly authority. Pilate represented the Roman power under whose authority the crucifixion was carried out. Blurring those stages turns a complicated historical situation into something far too simple. So when we reach that final night, the question is not merely why Caiaphas appears in the story. The more important question for understanding what happened to him is this: how did a man occupying such a politically sensitive position pass through those events and remain high priest after Jesus was crucified? Because he did remain, and that may be the first great surprise in the story of Caiaphas. Now we come to the night that made Caiaphas one of the most recognizable names in the Passion narrative. Jesus had been arrested, and the Gospels describe a series of interrogations that would eventually lead him before Pontius Pilate. But there is an important distinction to keep in mind. The four Gospels do not present every event in exactly the same sequence or with exactly the same details. So rather than forcing them into a single reconstructed timeline, we need to focus on what they share while recognizing what each account actually says. Matthew and Mark place Jesus before the high priest and members of the council. John describes an earlier appearance before Annas, Caiaphas' father-in-law, and a former high priest who continued to carry considerable influence. Luke arranges parts of the proceedings differently. Despite those variations, Caiaphas remains associated with the priestly leadership involved in the process that preceded Jesus being handed over to Roman authority. According to the Gospels, accusations and testimony were brought against Jesus. The discussion involved statements attributed to him about the temple, questions surrounding his identity, and especially the issue of who he claimed to be. In Matthew and Mark, a decisive moment comes when the high priest directly asks Jesus whether he is the Messiah. His answer leads to an accusation of blasphemy, and those present judge him deserving of condemnation. But that still does not explain the crucifixion. By morning, Jesus is brought before Pontius Pilate, and the nature of the case takes on a distinctly political dimension. Before the Roman governor, the issue is no longer presented simply as an internal theological dispute. The accounts begin to emphasize kingship, authority, and the claim that Jesus was the king of the Jews. That shift matters. Rome could tolerate many different religious practices and traditions among the peoples under its control. A perceived claim to political authority, however, could be viewed very differently. Crucifixion itself was a Roman form of execution, used in part against people regarded as threats to imperial order. So to say simply that Caiaphas crucified Jesus would be historically inaccurate. The Gospels attribute a role to certain priestly authorities in the events leading to Jesus being handed over, but the crucifixion took place under Roman authority during the governorship of Pontius Pilate. That distinction matters for another reason as well. Across centuries, the Passion narrative has sometimes been used to assign collective blame to the Jewish people, a reading that distorts the historical setting itself. Jesus was Jewish, His disciples were Jewish. His earliest followers were Jewish. What the sources describe is a conflict involving specific individuals and groups within Jewish society, while ultimate imperial power in Judea remained in Roman hands. And there is one moment that helps us understand how those religious and political dimensions become intertwined within the sources themselves. In the Gospel of John, even before Jesus is arrested, the authorities discuss his growing influence and express concern over what Rome might do in response. It is in this context that Caiaphas delivers his famous statement, "It would be better for one man to die for the people than for the whole nation to perish." John gives the statement a theological meaning as well, but within the narrative there is also a very practical concern: Rome. The tension of that moment can be understood from the setting itself. Jerusalem was crowded for Passover. Pilgrims filled the city, the temple drew enormous gatherings, and the Roman administration had reason to watch closely for any disturbance. In that environment, a religious controversy could quickly acquire political consequences. Caiaphas exercised his authority precisely along that fragile boundary. None of this allows us to reconstruct every thought that passed through the high priest's mind that night. Nor should the gospel accounts be treated as though they were modern courtroom transcripts. What we can say is that these sources place Caiaphas among the principal priestly authorities involved in the events before Jesus was delivered to Pilate. Then Jesus is crucified. If the story ends there, Caiaphas seems to have played his part and vanished, but something far more interesting happened. He remained in office. And the movement surrounding Jesus remained as well. According to the book of Acts, Jerusalem would soon see followers of Jesus preaching publicly. Peter and John began attracting attention, and the authorities found themselves confronting an unexpected reality. The execution of Jesus had not meant the disappearance of his followers. Before long, Peter and John would be brought before Jerusalem's circle of authorities. And when Acts records the names of those gathered there, one of them takes us directly back to the night we have just reconstructed. Caiaphas was still there. Now the crucifixion is behind us. From this point forward, we can finally trace what happened to Caiaphas after Jesus and discover just how long this man remained at the centre of power. If anyone expected the crucifixion to bring the movement Jesus had begun to an end, the events described in the book of Acts present exactly the opposite. His followers did not disappear from Jerusalem. They returned to public spaces, began proclaiming that Jesus had risen from the dead, and before long they once again attracted the attention of the same authorities who had been involved in the events surrounding his final days. And this is where Caiaphas appears again. Acts tells us that Peter and John went to the temple and encountered a man who had been unable to walk from birth. According to the text, after he was healed, a crowd gathered around the apostles and Peter began speaking publicly about Jesus. The location made the episode especially significant. This was happening within the temple complex itself, the religious heart of Jerusalem and a place directly connected to priestly authority. The reaction came quickly. Acts says that priests, the captain of the temple guard, and members of the Sadducees approached the apostles while they were still speaking to the people. Peter and John were arrested and held until the following day. Then something crucial happens for our investigation. Acts chapter 4 describes a gathering of the authorities and specifically names Annas, Caiaphas, John, Alexander, and others belonging to the high priestly family. In other words, within the narrative of Acts, Caiaphas was still present in Jerusalem's circle of power after the crucifixion of Jesus. It may seem like a small detail, but it is extraordinarily important for answering the central question of this documentary. Caiaphas had not been immediately removed from office. The surviving sources do not describe an instant downfall, a Roman punishment following the crucifixion, or any sudden loss of his position. On the contrary, he remained connected to the priestly leadership exercising authority in Jerusalem. Peter and John are then questioned about the power or authority by which they had done what had drawn so much public attention. According to Acts, Peter responds by proclaiming Jesus Christ and declaring that God had raised him from the dead. The council now faced an awkward situation. The man who had been healed was standing there, the event had become publicly known, and the reaction of the population had to be taken into account. But this is where we need to resist turning the episode into a personal showdown between Caiaphas and Peter. Acts names Caiaphas among those present, but it does not record every word he personally spoke, nor does it tell us exactly what he was thinking. The decision is presented as the result of the council's deliberation. After discussing the situation, The authorities order Peter and John to stop teaching in the name of Jesus. The two refuse to remain silent and are eventually released. The movement continues. In the chapters that follow, Acts describes the apostles teaching again in Jerusalem, further arrests and another confrontation with the council. The Christian narrative presents a community that, far from disappearing after the crucifixion, was growing in the very city where Jesus had been executed. And here lies one of the striking historical contrasts of the period. While the followers of Jesus were publicly proclaiming that their teacher was alive, Caiaphas was still serving as high priest. We do not need to invent secret conversations, sleepless nights, or a private crisis of faith to make that fascinating. The sources do not tell us how Caiaphas personally interpreted those claims. We do not know whether he regarded them primarily as a religious challenge, a threat to public order, or simply another movement that had to be managed. What we do know is far more concrete. He remained in office during the earliest years of the Christian movement, and his longevity was still remarkable. Caiaphas had become high priest around AD 18, and would remain in that position through virtually the entire governorship of Pontius Pilate in Judea. While other figures appeared and disappeared around him, the high priest remained. And if you enjoy following biblical stories beyond the episodes everyone already knows, subscribe to the channel and share this documentary with someone who also enjoys uncovering the history behind these accounts. And tell us in the comments what city you're watching from, because we want to know how far this community is reaching. And while you're there, tell us what decade or historical period you'd like us to explore in the next documentary. But Caiaphas' time in power did have an end, and what makes his downfall especially interesting is that, at least according to the sources that survive, it was not brought about by the followers of Jesus. There is no reliable record of Peter defeating Caiaphas, of a secret conversion, or of some extraordinary punishment suddenly falling upon him. The answer comes from another source, not Acts, not the Gospels, but the writings of the Jewish historian Josephus. And when the political landscape of Judea shifted, the man who had managed to hold the high priesthood for nearly 2 decades finally lost his position. For nearly 2 decades, Caiaphas remained high priest while Judea moved through repeated periods of political and religious tension. His tenure had begun around AD 18, during the administration of Valerius Gratus, and continued through almost the entire governorship of Pontius Pilate. But around AD 36, that long balance finally came to an end, and the force behind Caiaphas' removal was not Peter, John, or any other member of the early Christian movement. It was Rome. To understand what happened, we need to look at a crisis that did not directly involve Caiaphas at all. According to the Jewish historian Josephus, Pontius Pilate became involved in a serious confrontation with a group of Samaritans. A man had gathered followers with the promise of revealing sacred objects supposedly hidden on Mount Gerizim. Pilate interpreted the gathering as a threat and sent forces to stop the movement. The confrontation turned violent. Some were killed, others were captured, and Samaritan representatives eventually brought a formal complaint against Pilate to Lucius Vitellius, the Roman governor of Syria and one of the most powerful imperial officials in the region. Vitellius acted. Pilate was ordered to Rome to answer before Emperor Tiberius for accusations connected to his administration, bringing roughly a decade of Roman rule in Judea to an end. Not long afterward, another major change reached Jerusalem. Josephus records that Vitellius removed Joseph, called Caiaphas from the high priesthood, and appointed Jonathan, a son of Annas, in his place. The account itself is remarkably brief. There is no dramatic scene of Caiaphas being dragged from the temple, no description of public humiliation, and no indication that his removal was punishment for his involvement in the events surrounding Jesus or for opposition to the earliest Christians. That distinction matters. It would be tempting to turn his removal into a moment of immediate justice, as though Rome had finally turned against the man who had managed to remain in power for so many years. But the surviving evidence does not allow us to make that connection. We also do not know exactly why Vitellius chose to replace him. The decision may have been connected to the broader political reorganization surrounding Pilate's departure. Vitellius may simply have wanted a different relationship with Jerusalem's local leadership. What we can say with confidence is what Josephus records. Caiaphas was removed from the high priesthood. And then something even more intriguing happens. The man who appears in the Gospels is named again in Acts, and held one of Jerusalem's most important offices for nearly 18 years, practically disappears from the surviving historical record. We have no reliable account of his final years. We do not know with certainty where he lived after leaving office. We do not know how he responded to losing his position. We do not know whether he continued to exercise influence through his powerful family connections. And most importantly, no secure ancient source tells us when or how Caiaphas died. That silence created space for later traditions, religious interpretations, and stories about his fate. But none of them should be confused with what can actually be established historically. And perhaps that is the most surprising answer to the question at the centre of this documentary. What happened to Caiaphas after Jesus was crucified? He did not immediately fall from power. He remained high priest. Acts still places him within Jerusalem's circle of authority. He continued in office for several more years until, around AD 36, the same imperial system under which he had exercised his authority replaced him. After that, we lose his trail, at least in the written record. Because nearly 2,000 years later, a name associated with Caiaphas would surface again in Jerusalem, not in a newly discovered manuscript, and not in some forgotten Christian tradition, but carved into a limestone burial box found inside an ancient tomb. The year was 1990, and that discovery raised an extraordinary question. Could archaeology have uncovered the tomb of Caiaphas's family, and perhaps even the remains of Caiaphas himself? The answer is fascinating, but it is nowhere near as simple as some popular versions of the story make it sound. For nearly 2,000 years, the silence remained. After Josephus records Caiaphas's removal from the high priesthood around AD 36, we have no secure ancient source that allows us to follow his final years. But in 1990, an accidental discovery in Jerusalem brought a name associated with Caiaphas back into the hands of researchers. It began during construction work south of Jerusalem's Old City, in an area known as the Peace Forest. Workers uncovered an ancient rock-cut tomb, and archaeologists were called in to investigate. The tomb dated to the Second Temple period and contained several ossuaries, small stone boxes used in Jewish burial practices at the time. The custom was very different from modern burial. After an initial period inside the tomb, the bones of the deceased could be gathered and placed in an ossuary. Thousands of these limestone boxes have been discovered in and around Jerusalem, but one of the ossuaries in this particular tomb immediately stood out. It was decorated with carved rosette patterns and, more importantly, bore inscriptions. One of them was interpreted by researchers as Yehoseph bar Caiaphas, generally rendered as Joseph, son of Caiaphas, or understood as a reference to the family name Caiaphas. The coincidence immediately attracted attention. Josephus identifies the high priest known from the New Testament as Joseph Caiaphas. Now, archaeologists had a first-century tomb in Jerusalem containing an ossuary associated with both Joseph and the name Caiaphas. Could this be the same man? This is where an extraordinary archaeological discovery has to be separated from an absolute conclusion. The combination is certainly significant. The period fits the world in which Caiaphas lived. The location fits Jerusalem. The burial context suggests a family of means, and the inscription carries an obvious connection to the name preserved in ancient sources. For those reasons, the possibility that the tomb belonged to the family of the historical high priest has been taken seriously by scholars. But archaeology does not work on compelling coincidences alone. The inscription does not say, Joseph Caiaphas, high priest of Jerusalem involved in the events surrounding Jesus of Nazareth. Nothing on the ossuary identifies its occupant in those terms. So even when the connection is regarded as plausible, and by some as highly persuasive, there remains a fundamental difference between saying that the ossuary may belong to the historical Caiaphas and claiming that his identity has been proven beyond dispute. That distinction becomes even more important when we consider the human remains found inside the tomb. The site contained the remains of multiple individuals. Those remains can tell researchers something about burial customs and the people placed within that family tomb, but they do not automatically provide a label connecting a particular set of bones to the Caiaphas known from the Gospels and Josephus. For that reason, the discovery cannot tell us with certainty how Caiaphas died, what his health was like during his final years, or exactly when he was buried. Those answers remain beyond what the surviving evidence can establish, and none of that makes the discovery less important. In fact, it makes it even more fascinating. For the first time, researchers had a possible material connection between a name preserved in first-century written sources and a family buried in Jerusalem during that same historical period. Archaeology was not proving the theological claims of the Gospels, nor was it automatically confirming every detail of Caiaphas' story. it was offering something different, a possible physical window into the social and family world to which this historical figure belonged. And now, we can finally answer the question that opened this documentary. After the crucifixion of Jesus, Caiaphas remained high priest. Acts still names him among the authorities in Jerusalem. Years later, around AD 36, Josephus records his removal from office by Vitellius. From that point forward, the written sources leave his personal fate largely in darkness. The discovery made in 1990 may have brought us closer to his family, and perhaps even to Caiaphas himself. But possibility cannot be turned into certainty. And perhaps that is where this story reaches its most intriguing conclusion. For a man who appears so clearly in some of the best-known pages of the New Testament, the most historically responsible answer still ends with uncertainty. We know how Caiaphas lost his power. We know approximately when it happened. But when it comes to what happened to him after he left the high priesthood, history remains silent. In the end, the story of Caiaphas does not conclude with the dramatic punishment many might expect. After the crucifixion of Jesus, he remained high priest, continued to occupy a place near the centre of religious authority in Jerusalem, and is still named in Acts among the authorities confronting the earliest followers of Jesus. Years later, around AD 36, Josephus records what we can say with confidence. Caiaphas was removed from office by Vitellius. After that, the ancient sources no longer allow us to trace his life with any certainty. We do not know how he spent his final years. We do not know when or how he died. And as fascinating as the archaeological discovery of 1990 may be, it does not allow us to turn a possible identification into absolute proof. Perhaps that silence is precisely what makes his fate so compelling. Caiaphas took part in events that would echo across 2,000 years of history, yet his own path almost completely disappears from the record once he loses power. And there is an irony that is difficult to overlook. The movement that certain authorities in Jerusalem attempted to contain did not disappear with the crucifixion. It continued to grow, moved beyond the borders of Judea, and eventually reached places none of the people involved could have imagined. And if this documentary showed you just how easy it is to lose track of Caiaphas, Annas, Pilate, the Gospels, Acts, and everything that happened before and after, that is exactly why we created our ebook, The Bible in Chronological Order. This complete visual guide helps you map every king, every prophet, and every empire from Genesis to Revelation, so you can follow the biblical story as one clear, continuous timeline. By getting your copy today, you're not only taking your understanding of Scripture to a deeper level, you're also helping support our team so we can continue producing investigative documentaries like this one. The official link to get your ebook is pinned in the first comment, and before you go, tell us what city you're watching from and what decade or historical period you'd like to see explored in the next documentary. Because when we follow the sources only as far as they can truly take us, some of the most fascinating stories in the Bible do not end with an invented answer. They end exactly where the evidence ends. And in the case of Caiaphas, nearly 2,000 years later, that silence is still part of the story.